Today we have a crazy revenge story against siblings. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, I took my ex's money and fled the country with our children. Many years back, my children and I left our home country, entered this country, and made it our new home. My children's father and I started sleeping together when he was employed as our pool boy. He was handsome, my goodness. He was so good looking that one day, I overheard my stepmom's friend mention just how cute he was. She even joked about asking him about his age and then asking for his number if he was old enough. My ex was that gorgeous. I'm from a rich family, at least rich enough to be recognized as such in my home country. My dad made a lot of money and my stepmom's father was a governor. We were rich by all standards. My ex, on the other hand, was the son of a civil servant. His mom raised him and his brothers all by herself. When I first saw him, I knew I wanted him. He was just too cute. I started to think more about him and my feelings for him began to show. It was impossible to hide it. We would lock eyes and all that cute stuff. One day, one thing led to another and we hooked up in my bedroom. That went on for a while until I got pregnant. My parents were furious. My dad swore to kill him. After making a show of anger, my parents decided to cool it down. They spoke with him about his intentions for me and decided that I could have the baby. My ex pleaded with me many times to not abort his child. He promised me a shiny future and told me that he may not be able to hold his own financially at that time, but he would do all he could to ensure that my baby and I were fine for the rest of our lives. I was flattered and thought that he loved me, but my ex was an opportunist who just wanted to be associated with our family. After I had my baby, my ex would come over to my home to see the baby. I thought that was nice, but my ex was never comfortable with the arrangement. He wanted us to live together as man and wife so we could raise our baby together. I was excited that he wanted to be a part of our lives. What I did not know was that my ex had that planned all along. That was precisely what he wanted, to get as close as he could be to my dad's wealth. He moved in with us, and that was also fine until he said he was uncomfortable with the situation. He said my dad was controlling and that he wanted us to move out of my parents so he could be the man of his family. I was stupid and in love, so I agreed to move out with him. My parents kicked against the idea. They said my ex did not have the financial capability to take care of us both. He didn't even own a house at the time. My dad was disappointed in me, but he still wanted to help his daughter. So he offered my ex a job in the family's company and let us live in an apartment he owned. When I moved in with my ex, he became very emotionally abusive. I could never do anything right. Everything I did was a threat to his position as the head of our family. He hated it when I visited my parents and friends and would refuse to talk to me for days whenever I did. I naturally stopped visiting as much. When I started talking about going to university, he started talking about having a second child. And soon enough, I got pregnant with my second child. While I was pregnant, the abuse increased. He wanted to know everything I was doing while he was away. He would accuse me of wasting food and toiletries. He measured everything I used in the house and only let me use as much as he liked. Worst of all, he started to cheat on me with a lady who worked for my parents. I was aware of their relationship and it broke me. But I didn't know what to do. I remember crying one night and telling him how much he hurt me. He smiled and told me he had a right to cheat on me. He then pointed at my body and told me that he could list 10 things wrong with my body and asked how I expected him to be content with a body like mine. Don't forget that we were expecting our second child at the time, so I was heavily pregnant. I wanted to tell my parents about what was going on, but I feared that they would blame me and say they warned me. I also thought at the time that if I never reported his behavior, then it meant I was a good wife. We never actually got married. My stepmom had also started to ask about when my ex was going to marry me officially. I would lie that my ex was too focused on work and making money. While all of this was going on, my ex would make fun of me, of my body. He would tell me that the only advantage I had was that my family had some money. And then he'd swear that in no time he'd make so much money that my father would worship him. I decided to leave my ex one evening. I was cleaning the house that evening and holding my second child in another when I decided I had to leave. I just decided that that life was not for me. I also realized that if I was home with my parents, I would not have to do so many chores. Unfortunately for me, I found out I was pregnant the next day, and all my plans for leaving changed. I decided to stay back and see if my ex would become a better man now that we were going to have yet another child. When he found out I was pregnant, he was happy and his behavior toward me changed for a while. I was glad that everything was getting better, but after I had my third child, my ex became the worst possible version of himself. He started his own business and was making more money than he'd ever made. He also had the advantage of being connected to my family. Many of his clients were people he knew through my family. My parents wanted his business to grow, so they referred him to their friends and associates. Still, my ex's behavior worsened. He started to disappear. He would go away for long stretches and not return until he felt like it, and I dared not question where he'd been. On one such occasion, I started to seriously consider leaving my ex. I realized that I benefited nothing from being with him. My children hardly ever even saw him, and I was raising them alone. I decided I was going to leave him. I wasn't just going to leave him, but I also wanted to leave the country with my children and start over. My ex loved everyone knowing that we had children together, not because he really cared for my children, but because he needed them to know that he had a child with a member of my family. He knew that would uplift his social status. Taking my children from him was going to be a huge punishment. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to do more than just that, so I decided I was going to steal his money. My ex grew up in a family where they didn't have a lot of money, so he had a bad relationship with money. He could never bring himself to save his money in a bank. He always wanted to see his money, so he would stack his cash in different corners of the room. When he noticed that I'd figured out where he stacked his cash, he stopped keeping money in different parts of our bedroom. I wasn't going to take his money anyway. My parents still send me an allowance regularly. But like I said, he was used to an environment where people stole his money, so he stopped stacking his money in our room and took it elsewhere. We had a guest room in our house, one that we only ever used when my ex wanted to be alone. I found out later that my ex had been saving his money there. He took very good care of his room and kept the money in a safe. The safe was not locked, and anyone who knew where he kept the money could easily have access to it. The first person I talked about the abuse I'd been facing in my family was my cousin. I told her all about what had been happening and told her that I wanted to leave the marriage and the country. She agreed that it was a good plan and suggested I change my children's last name to my family name. There was no need for that. I never gave my children my ex's last name, and he suggested that. She then advised me to tell my parents. She warned that not telling them would mean that they would continue to share their resources with him and give his business more growth. I agreed with her and eventually told my stepmom, who was shocked. She admitted that she knew we were having problems, but she thought they were regular problems that people had when they first started living together. I told her I wanted to leave the country with my children, and she agreed that it was a good idea. My stepmom told my dad, and my dad immediately cut my ex out of his resources. My parents stopped referring his business, and my cousin told me that my mom even started to badmouth his business to others. Business started to go down and my ex became friendly. He tried on 2 occasions to get me to talk to my parents and see if he could get a loan for expansion. I promised I'd talk to them and he believed me. When the embassy called us to inform us that our visas were ready, I started to prepare for our trip. I knew I couldn't do that when my ex was around, of course, so I planned to tell him that the kids and I needed to stay at my parents' for a weekend. Luckily, he disappeared as usual, so I just got up and took my kids to my parents, where I was able to comfortably plan our trip. Before I left, I went into the guest room and took all my ex's money. I took the money in his safe, I took the ones he left under the pillow, the ones he hid in a box under his bed. I took all his money with me. My ex didn't realize we'd left the house until my kids and I were nearly at our destination. I remember using a telephone at the airport to inform my mom that we had arrived, and she laughed and said my ex had just called to ask if I was home with her. I was done with my ex, so I never bothered to contact him again. And he didn't even know how to contact me, or he would have. My cousin told me though that my dad ejected him from the apartment he gifted us, and that my ex's business went downhill. She said he went to my parents' house numerous times, swearing that he didn't want me, but that he'd like the money I took from him back. He never got over it. Dude thought he could build his business in my family's name while resenting me for being from a wealthy family. I'm certain that if his business had grown and become big, he'd have done one of his disappearing acts and then never showed up again. So from the get-go, you're telling me that this was a guy that was just in it for the money the whole time? They probably just got with OP because they were from that wealthy family, and they saw it as either a step up for them socially or a potential partner that they could just live off of for the rest of their life, I guess. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is my experience with a bad boss. My name is Jay. I'm a 27-year-old female who has made too many career mistakes for a girl my age. What I mean is that I've not made smart career decisions since I started in the corporate world. In fact, what I've done so far has been hopping from one job to another, seeking greener pastures that eventually became non-existent. You know, you can imagine me as a lady who was so lucky to get great jobs and work with wonderful bosses. I remember when I got a very flexible job with a multinational company. I was so joyful, and I looked forward to bringing my best foot forward. Fast forward to 6 months into that job, and I got into a squabble with my superior, which led to a heated argument at work. To be honest, my superior was right, but I just couldn't give in amicably. All I could have said was sorry, which I intentionally hoarded so jealously. Eventually, I was summoned before a panel for unruly behavior, and I remember praying silently that I got a second chance to retain my job. Well, I didn't get to keep the job because I was labeled unruly and insolent. That was the end of that job for me. To be honest, I didn't feel like I lost anything because I was confident that I would get another job in no time. True to my speculation, I got another job in no time. And while it seemed as though I was there to stay, something unexpected came up again, and I left by myself. That was the trend in my life until I got stuck with a bad boss for a long time. The episodes are still shocking for me as I replay them in my head. First, I got another job as an executive assistant at an oil and gas company. You can call me lucky, huh? I felt the same way too, until I had reasons to feel otherwise. But this time, I was already stuck. First, I noticed that my boss was the type of boss who liked to downplay one's efforts. I remember the first month I got there, and I dutifully carried out a task he gave me with zest and a strong feeling that I had impressed him. But I was shocked when he asked me if that was the best thing I could do. To be honest, I felt out of place at that moment because I knew I'd gone all out to deliver the task. That was the beginning of all my woes in that office. I never got a thank you or a great job done, and if I must say so myself, I knew how much I tried to impress my boss, but none of the efforts were ever enough. So unconsciously, I became complacent and I never saw the need to improve on anything. With time, I began to wait patiently for the day he would lay me off. But it seemed the longer I waited, the more it seemed my boss didn't care if I left or stayed. It was a dark period in my life because, for some reasons, I couldn't leave like I'd always done. One time I was with my boss for a meeting that was scheduled with a multinational company. He had asked me to kindly prepare his slides for that meeting, which I did. He went through it some days before we proceeded with the meeting, and I felt we were good. But I was surprised when he started to point out some things while we were en route to the meeting at the last minute. I became numb and confused. At that point, I couldn't help but feel that my boss's hatred towards me was way deeper than I thought, and I began to wonder if I was being punished for all the jobs I'd left without any care in the world, or if it was just me that wasn't ticking all my boxes right. That day, after he called me incompetent and a sluggish person, I was compelled to ask him if he employed me to speak down on me or to just be an insatiable boss. To my surprise, the venom in him seemed to intensify when I spoke up for myself. Even though I had expected him to feel a little remorse, I was shocked when he asked me to get out of his car. He ordered his driver to pull up for me to get down. I was so hurt, but I managed to hold back my tears. I apologized for my insensitivity, and I urged him not to take my words to heart. He gave me one scornful look, and he asked his driver to continue the trip. When I got home, I got into the tub and shed some real tears. I couldn't believe I was stuck with a bad boss who was both callous and uninterested in my mental well-being. It was worse that I couldn't leave because I was on a loan scheme, which I had a limited amount of time to offset. And the last thing I wanted to do was change jobs again. The next morning I showed up at work, and I was sure that my boss was a bit startled to see me. I could tell that he showed the feeling of guilt that someone displays when they have wronged other people. But at the same time, such people think they shouldn't apologize just because they feel they are bigger. But I care less. I didn't come back to feed his ego. I came back to teach him a lesson. At that point, I was ready to put on my bad girl apron because I was done being weak and feeling vulnerable. I also didn't care if I lost my job. I think what I cared about the most at that point was teaching my boss a lesson that he would never recover from. Then I noticed he acted a little humane towards me, and I also heard him mutter, "Thank you," when I delivered a task to him. I knew he did all that to show that he was sorry for being a mean boss all along, but I had crossed him as a dangerous person who probably hasn't felt enough love in his life. You know, I'm a very soft person when I want to be, and I wasn't surprised to see how much my heart had softened towards my boss despite my intention to seek revenge. I found myself smiling at him at every little opportunity, and I didn't get to worry too much about his next outburst. However, I had a feeling that my boss would soon go back to who he was in a matter of days. I knew that all he put up was just camouflage to redeem his image. After some time, he asked me to write a proposal for a job he was seriously bidding for. I was happy that I would finally be able to win a job for my boss, at least to consolidate the good times we were having. I quickly got to work on the proposal as soon as I could, and trust me to give it my best shot. I did extensive research on the rival companies, and I made sure I pointed out our absolute advantage. I carried my boss along through every stage of the proposal, and he gave his nodding approval at every step. So eventually we submitted the proposal, but we didn't get the deal. You know, that was the saddest day for me in that place. I couldn't believe I gave so much only to get nothing in return. And to top it all off, the job was given to a company that my boss had had a long-time feud with. When I got to work the next day, I didn't need a soothsayer to show me that the atmosphere was fully charged with melancholy. I knew my boss was about to unleash his venom when he said nothing to my usual morning greetings. And eventually, we got into a conversation, which led to him to ask me why I couldn't get anything right. I was shocked to hear him say that. He went on to say, and I quote, "If only you had done your job right, we would all be reeling in joy right now." I couldn't comprehend his statement, and my eyes quickly became bloodshot. How could he blame me for something I didn't have control over? How? He said some unprintable things that made me feel like I was the reason why the company was losing millions of dollars. I was shocked to hear that because I saw myself as only a tiny part of the organization. At that point, I accepted that my boss was always going to be someone who took pleasure in victimizing others. I made up my mind to leave, and at that time for good, but I knew it would be unfair of me to not give my boss a dose of his own medicine. First, I became more determined to get a proposal that would land the company a huge deal. Not that it was necessary, but I needed to do it for my mental health and confidence. I wrote and canceled several proposals until I finally got one right. I went ahead to bid for a big job without my boss's knowledge. At least, I knew I could deal with any disappointment alone. Fortunately for me, the proposal made sense to whomever it was meant to make sense to, and we got the deal. When I told my boss about it, I was just as surprised as he was. He had a huge smile on his face, and I could sense that he was pleased with my thoughtfulness. With that, he told me he was going to gather everyone at the organization to share the win with them. I smiled because I knew that would be the perfect time to give him a plot twist. I didn't discourage him from gathering everyone together to celebrate me because I was just as interested in the gathering myself. The day came, and everyone was eager to see the lucky girl who got the boss's admiration and who deserved a shout out. As expected, some were curious and some were green with envy. The boss came in and was all smiles. He rubbed his palms together and invited me forward excitedly, but before I came out, he told everyone eagerly that I was proactive enough to send a proposal out, which landed us a deal worth millions of dollars. At that point, all eyes were piercing through me, and I could tell that they were wondering how I was able to pull that up. Eventually, I was given a chance to address everyone present, and I knew that my moment had come. I got up, stared at everyone, and eventually rested my eyes on my boss, who was obviously all smiles. I said nothing as I stared deeply into his soul. I could see that there was suspense in the room, which was gradually dissipating into tension. Everyone was wondering if I was okay and why I kept silent for some time. I finally found my voice and I couldn't stop talking. I made it clear that I had never believed I would have a boss who was both a gaslighter and an insensitive person. That was definitely not what was expected of me, and I could see that my boss was adjusting himself relentlessly on his seat. I stated that my time at the organization had been filled with pain, regrets, tears, and fear. I couldn't thank my boss for making me doubt my sanity and who I was in every sense. I told everyone that I dedicate my success to God and the spirit of resilience. I dropped a letter to my boss in front of everyone, and I walked out briskly but majestically. I could tell that my boss was taken by surprise. I could see the shock on his face, and that was enough to compensate me for all my troubles. I guess OP on sort of the way out one way or the other, they didn't really have anything to lose by trying to expose the boss like this. I mean, and especially if you do that and you get like reprimanded or fired, like yeah, it might reflect that OP was being inappropriate saying that out loud in front of everybody. But how does that also not in the subconscious of these people reflect poorly on the boss themselves? Our next story is the moral lesson my siblings very much needed. I, male 31, being the first son of my father and of my family, was expected to just sit there and watch my siblings take every single thing my father left behind for me when he passed away, which included the total control over every single one of his assets and finances, and basically all of the houses he owned across the state, and even internationally, and also control of every single one of his offshore accounts, as this was truly where the majority of his wealth was. And even after his passing, I could not be as greedy as taking every single thing for myself and leaving nothing for my siblings. But then when they begin to feel entitled to more than they should, I decided to teach them a lesson and basically put them in their place. My father, while he was alive, was the sole heir to his family fortune, which was gathered majorly by his father and his father's father. Basically, they had been dominating the woodwork and carpentry business for decades. And now, everything was entrusted to me. But right before that, I would like to give you a little walkthrough of my entire family and how they are and treated me, so that you might have a better understanding as to why I did what I did to them, when I had decided that they had stepped out of line. Back when my father was still alive, hale and healthy, this was way back when I was still in high school, he was always making it a point to inform me of the responsibilities I was going to eventually have to shoulder, and how he wanted me to shape myself into becoming a better man and a better version of myself. One that he thought would be totally needed when the time came. At the time, I didn't really think much of it, as I was still in my teenage years at the time, and so in an attempt to make me truly understand what was at stake, my father totally and completely cut me off. No finances or help whatsoever, and mind you, I was still in high school at the time. There was practically no way for me to have come out of that situation. Things were hard for quite a long time, as he had also taken it upon himself to put me in the school's dormitory. Seeing as they had one, this was by far one of the things that my father had ever done that made me hate him from the bottom of my heart. At the time, I didn't even realize the reason behind what he did most of the times, but this time, for some weird, unexplainable reason, I was able to see past all the hate that was building inside myself, and ultimately realized that he was only doing all of these for my sake, and for the betterment of my future, as he really didn't want any sort of bad behavior to totally jeopardize my future. My father was always selfless, and thought more about others than himself. This was evident in the way he treated me, which was practically different from the way he treated every other member of our family. I have 3 other siblings, by the way. Together we're 4 children from my mother, for my father. Anyways, right after his attempt at teaching me a lesson, he finally invited me back home, in the hopes that I had at least understood something, and he was right in doing so, honestly speaking, but there was just the one thing that I didn't want again at that time, which was, I didn't want to go back to the way I was living, dependent on him for every single thing I needed or wanted. It didn't seem like a life I wanted for myself and for my future, and so I turned him down right then and there. This obviously came as a shock to him, as he most definitely was not expecting to have happened at that time, but then I guess you could say that his lesson worked way too well. But then it was what you had decided, and then right after high school, he still asked me to come back to the house, as he told me that the doors to the home were always and forever open to me whenever I chose to come back and all. But I was still insistent on not coming back, and things went on the way it did for quite a while. The next phase of my life at the time was getting into college. This proved to be quite the hassle, as the major obstacle I had faced was finances. I was barely able to get myself in and through college, as I didn't realize how expensive and costly it would be getting admission, sorting out your fees, and ultimately living day to day in the confines of the school, all without having a reasonable source of income to get you through. This was the point in my life where I thought long and hard on whether or not I was going to phone home and ask for their support. but every single time I stopped at dialing the home line, and I was always rethinking my decision and second-guessing myself. But then things ultimately worked out, and I was able to graduate college with the help of my student loans and also from some friends I made along the way. I finally got my degree in engineering, and I was practically on my way to developing myself and becoming my own man. And I guess this is where my father truly felt proud of me. Then one fateful day, he had called me back to the family house as he wanted to see me, but seeing as I was still too busy at the time to even make the trip back home, and also the fact that I was extremely short on funds to even afford a plane ticket back home, I decided to ignore the home call at that time, probably till a later date. And then I guess the message went straight to voicemail. But then I got a 10-minute voicemail about 2 days later, after my father had invited me home. And in the voicemail, it was basically my father telling me how proud of me he was, and how he would have given anything to see me succeed in life, achieve all my goals and all. He said in the voicemail that I was by far the best thing that had ever happened to him. He also told me he wanted to see my face one last time before he gave up the ghost. But then I wasn't able to make it, to be there for my father when he needed me the most. Before I could even finish listening to the voicemail, I had already broken down in tears. This was quite literally the height of it all. I didn't realize how self-invested I'd been all these years. That the one person I wanted to prove wrong and make acknowledge me had already done so way back and was already the proudest father on earth. I couldn't control my tears. The next thing I did right then and there was to pack up the entirety of everything I owned and basically went back home. I just felt like I needed to be back home, for my family and most especially myself. It was needed at that time. When I got home, I was welcomed by my teary-eyed mother, who was just so happy to see her son once again. She gave me a tight 3-minute hug and I broke down in tears again. The whole family seemed excited to see me at this time. But then there was no room for overexcitement, as a tragedy had just struck. My mother took me inside, got me settled in, and basically sat me down to tell me every single detail of what happened right before my father had passed. And I found myself crying seriously once again. She told me how proud my father was to have had me as his first son, and that he never spared to make mention of it every single day. Deep down, I felt really bad about myself, as I could remember that my father had called me prior to the day I received the voicemail, but then I feigned being busy, and that was how I didn't get to see my father before his passing. There was quite literally nothing I could have done to remotely console myself at the time. Anyways, the proceedings for his burial were underway in the coming week, and by the weekend, we had completely laid my father to rest. And this was when I decided not to take any further step in the career I wanted to work so hard to build and just stay behind with my family. I had officially moved back into the house, not fully attempting to take the position of man of the house, but then I knew everyone wasn't just going to accept me fully. But then I could have cared less, seeing as I was already feeling responsible for the well-being of every single one of my family. This was when things started to get really interesting. So my father's lawyers came on over, basically to declare his assets and announce his will to the entirety of his family members, for his nuclear family basically. During this announcement, quite a few hopes were broken, and there was quite literally shock in the faces of every single person that was seated in the room. So after declaration of his assets, the total financial worth of everything kept behind by my father was quite a humongous sum. One so bogus that it could set up 3 generations for life. And the best part of everything was the fact that it all went under my name, as my father had left everything he had inherited, worked for, and owned under my name. And soon after this announcement, I could quite literally feel the stares of my family members, my mother, my brother and sisters, and basically everyone present there, poking me and all. But I could have cared less, as this just seemed like the most likely choice at this time, seeing as every single one of them had been living their lives under the umbrella of my father and his wealth, and none of them ever truly felt the need to assume responsibility, proper one at that. A few weeks later, after I had assumed full control of the assets, I had decided to share them at my discretion. I gave my mother a substantial amount of funds and also some cars, alongside the entirety of the family house. As for my siblings, seeing as none of them had gotten to their 20s, I didn't really see the need for any of them to manage properly a huge sum of money, and so I gave them an amount that was proper to me at the time, and I settled every other person that deserved it in my view. However, even after doing this and promising my siblings that I had something waiting in store for them when they had attained the age I had deemed worthy of being in control of large amounts of money, they were still not content with what I'd given them, and they began demanding I give them more. I initially didn't pay it any attention, but then when they went ahead to table the matter before our mother in an attempt to see whether or not he could control me into giving them proper shares of the money, she turned them down, and instead came to inform me. I don't even know what got into me, but then I just felt like they needed to understand the concept of consequences. To do this, I just withdrew all of the financial support I'd given them and practically left them on their own to properly understand responsibility and the reason behind my actions. I basically put them through the exact same thing I went through in order to teach them the lesson I had learned some years back. Although it was extremely hard on them, seeing as they'd been complacent all their lives, it was necessary. It was at this time that I truly understood the real reason behind my father's actions some years back. I think it's worth OP to consider how they felt when their dad treated them that way and consider whether or not that's fair to pass the buck on to other people in that way. That said, if you have a huge amount of money and people are pestering you for it and making you feel like you're not good enough because you're not just shoving a lion's share of chips to them, I can kind of understand why at some point you're like, you keep on begging, I'm just not going to give you anything. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.